Complete Works of Swami Vivekananda, Volume 3, Section 4. The Future of India. The Future of India. This is the ancient land where wisdom made its home before it went into any other country. The same India whose influx of spirituality is represented, as it were, on the material plane, by rolling rivers like oceans where the eternal Himalayas, rising tire above tires, with their snow caps, look at it where into the very mysteries of heaven. Here is the same India whose soil has been trodden by the feet of the greatest sages that ever lived. Here first sprang up inquiries into the nature of man, into the eternal internal world. Here first arose the doctrine of immorality of the souls, the existence of the supervising God, and immanent God in nature and in man, and here the highest ideals of religion and philosophy have attained their culmination points. This is a land from whence, like the tidal wave, spirituality and philosophy have been again and again rushed out and deluged the world. And this is a land from whence, once more, such tides must proceed in order to bring life and vigor into the decaying races of mankind. It is the same India which has withstood the shock of centuries of hundreds of foreign invasions, of hundreds of upheavals of manners and custom. It is the same land which stands firmer than any rock in the world, with its underlying vigor, indestructible life. Its life is of the same nature of the soul, without beginning, without end, immortal, and we are children of such a country. Children of India, I am here to speak to you today about some practical things, and my object is reminding you about the glories of the past in simply this. Many times have I been told that looking into the past only degenerates and leads to nothing, and that we should look into the future. That is true, but out of the past is built the future. Look back, therefore, as far as you can, drink deep of the eternal fountains that are behind, and after that, look forward, march forward, and make India brighter, greater, and much higher than she ever was. Our ancestors were great. We must first recall that. We must learn the elements of our being, the blood that courses in our veins. We must have faith in the blood and what it did in the past. And out of the faith and consciousness of the past greatness, we must build an India yet greater than what she has been. There have been periods of decay and degradation. I do not attach much importance to them, and we all know that such periods have been necessary. A mighty tree produces a beautiful ripe fruit. That fruit falls on the ground, it decays and rot, and out of the decayed spring the root and the future tree, perhaps mightier than the first one. This period of decay through which we have passed was all more necessary. Out of this decay is coming the India of the future. It is sprouting. Its first leaves are already out, and a mighty gigantic tree, the Vruddhavamula, is here, already beginning to appear, and it is about that I am going to speak to you. The problem in India are more complicated, more momentous than the problem in any other country. Race, religion, language, government, all these together make a nation. The elements which compose the nation of the world are indeed very few. Taking races, taking race after race, compared to this country, here have been the Aryan, the Dravidians, the Tartars, the Turk, the Mughal, the Europeans, all the nation of the world, as it were, pouring their blood into this land. Of languages, the most wonderful conglomeration is here. Of manners and custom, there is more difference between two Indian races than between European and Eastern races. The one common ground that we have is our sacred tradition, our religion. That is the only common ground, and upon that we shall have to build it. In Europe, political ideas form the national unity. In Asia, religious ideas form the national unity. The unity is religion. Therefore, it's absolutely necessary as the first condition of the future of India There must be the recognition of one religion throughout the length and breadth of this land. What do I mean by one religion? Not in the sense of one religion are held among the Christians or the Mohammedans or the Buddhists. We know that our religion has certain common grounds, common to all sectors. However, varying conclusion may be, however different their claims may be, so there are certain common grounds, and within their limitations, this religion of ours admits of the marvelous variations and infinite amount of liberty to think and live our own lives. We all know that at least those of us who have thought that thought, and what we want is to bring out this life giving common principles of our religion, and let every man and woman and child throughout the length and breadth of this country understand them, know them, and try to bring them into their own lives. This is the first step, and therefore it has to be taken. We see how in Asia, and especially in India, race difficulties, linguistic difficulties, social difficulties, national difficulties all melt away before this unifying power of religion. We know that to the Indian mind, there is nothing higher than religious idea, and that this is the keynote of Indian life, and we can only walk in the line of the least resistance. It is not only true that the ideal of religion is the highest ideal. In the case of India, it is the only possible means of work. Work in any other line without first strengthening this would be disastrous. Therefore, the first plank in the making of the future of India, the first step that is to be hew out of that rock of ages is this unification of religion. All of us have to be taught that we Hindus, dualists, qualified monist, Shivyas or Vaishnavas or Pashupatas, to want whatever domination we may belong, have certain common ideas behind us, and that the time has come when, for the well-being of ourselves and for the well-being of our race, we must give up all the little quarrels and differences. Be sure these quarrels are entirely wrong. They are condemned by our scriptures, forbidden by our forefathers, and those great men from whom we claim our descent, whose blood is in our vein, look down with contempt on their children, quarreling about minute difference. With the giving up of the quarrels, all other improvements will come. When the life blood is strong and pure, no disease germ can live in that body. Our life blood is spirituality. If it flows clear, if it flows strong and pure and vigorous, everything is right. Political, social, any other material defect, even the poverty of the land, will all be cured if that blood is pure. For if the disease germ be thrown out, nothing will be able to enter into the blood. To take a smile from the modern medicine, we know that there must be two causes to produce disease: some poisonous germ outside and the state of body. Until the body is in the state to admit the germ, until the body is degraded to a lower vitality so that the germ may enter and thrive and multiply, there is no power in any germ in the world to produce a disease in the body. In fact, millions of germs are continually passing through everybody's body, but so long as it is vigorous, it never is consigned of them. It is only when the body is weak that this germ take possession of it and produce disease. Just so with the national life, it is when the national body is weak that all sort of disease germs in the political state of the race or in the social state, in its educational and intellectual state, crowd into the system and produce disease. To remedy it, therefore, we must go to the root of this disease, cleanse the blood of all impurities. The one tendency will be strengthening the man to make the blood pure, the blood vigorous, so that it will be able to resist and throw off all external poisons. We have seen that our vigor, our strength, nay, our national life is in our religion. I am not going to discuss now whether it is right or wrong. whether it is correct or not, whether it is beneficial or not in the long run to have this vital in religion, but for good or evil is it is there. You cannot get out of it. You have to it now and forever. You have to stand by it, even if you have not the same faith that I have in our religion. You are bound by it, and if you give it up, you are smashed to pieces. That is the life of our race, and that must be strengthened. You have withstood the shocks of the centuries simply because you took great care of it. You sacrificed everything else for it. Your forefathers underwent everything boldly, even death itself, but preserved their religion. Temples after temples was broken down by the foreign conquerors, but no sooner that the wave passed than the spears of the temple rose up again. Some of these old temples of the southern India and those of this Somnath at Gujarat will teach you volumes of wisdom. Will any amount of the books will give you keener insight into the history of the race than any amount of book. Mark how these temples bear the mark of 100 attacks and 100 regenerations, continuously or continually destroyed and continually springing up out of the ruin, regenerated and strong as ever. That is the national mind, that is the national life current. Follow it and it leads to glory. Give it up and you die. That will be the only result. And he made and he annihilation. The only effect, the moment you step beyond that life current. I do not mean to say that other things are not necessary. I do not mean to say that political or social improvements are not necessary. But what I mean is this, and I want you to bear it in the mind that they are secondary here, and that religion is primary. The Indian mind is the first religious than anything else. So, this is to be strengthened, and how to do it. I will lay before you my ideas. They have been in my mind for long times, even years before I left the shores of Madras for America, and that I went to America and England was simply for propagating those ideas. I did not care at all for the Parliament of Religion or anything else. It was simply an opportunity, for it was really those ideas of mine that took me all over the world. My idea is first to of all to bring out the gems of spirituality that are stored up in our books and in the possession of few only, hidden as it were in the monasteries and in the forest, to bring them out, to bring the knowledge out of them, not only from the hands where it is hidden, but from the still more inaccessible chest, the language in which it is preserved, the incrustation of centuries of Sanskrit words. In one word, I want to make them popular. I want to bring out these ideas and let them be the common property of all, of every man in India, whether he knows the Sanskrit language or not. The great difficulty in the way of Sanskrit language, the glorious language of ours, and this difficulty cannot be removed until, if it is possible, the whole of our nation are good Sanskrit scholars. You will understand the difficulty when I tell you that I have been studying this language all my life, and yet every new book is new to me. How much more difficult would it be for people who never had time to study the language thoroughly? Therefore, the ideas must be taught in the language of the people. At the same time, Sanskrit education must go on along with it, because the very sound of Sanskrit words gives a prestige and power and strength to the race. The attempt of the great Ramanujan Chaitanya and the Kabir to raise the lower classes of India show that marvelous results were attained during the lifetime of those great prophets. At the later failures have to be explained, why and the cause shown why the effect of their teachings stopped almost within a century of the passing away of these great masters. The secret is here. They raised the lower classes. They had all the wish that this should come up, but they did not apply their energies to the spreading of the Sanskrit language among the masses. Even the great Buddha made one false step when he stopped the Sanskrit language from being studied by masses. He wanted rapid and immediate result and translated and preached in the language of the day Pali, in the language of day Pali. That was grand. He spoke in language of the people, and the people understood him. That was great. He spread the ideas quickly and made them reach far and wide. But along with that, Sanskrit ought to have spread. Knowledge came, but the prestige was not there. Culture was not there. It is culture that withstands shocks, not a simple mass of knowledge. You can put a mass of knowledge into the world, but that will not do it much good. There must come culture into the blood. We all know in the modern times of nations which have masses of knowledge, but what of them? They are like tigers, they are like savages. Because culture is not there, knowledge is only skin deep, as civilization is, and a little scratch brings out the old savage. Such thing happens. This is the danger. Teach the masses in the vernaculars. Give them ideas. They will get information, but sometimes more is necessary. Give them culture. Until you give them that, there can no permanency in the raised condition of the masses. There will be another caste created, having the advantage of the Sanskrit language, which will quickly get above the rest and rule them all the same. The only safety is the only safety I tell you men who belong to the lower caste, the only way to raise your condition is to study Sanskrit, and this fighting and writing and frothing against the higher caste is in vain. It does not go good. It does no good, and it creates fight and quarrels. And this race, unfortunately, already divided, is going to be divided more and more. The only way to bring about the leveling of caste is to appropriate the culture. The education, which is the strength of the higher caste, that done, you have what you want. In connection with this, I want to discuss one question which has a peculiar bearing with regard to Madras. There is a theory that there was a race of mankind in southern India called Dravidians, entirely different from the another race of the North India called Aryans, and that the southern Indian Brahmins are only Aryans that come from the north, and the other men of the South India belong to the entirely different caste and race to those of the southern Indian Brahmins. Now, I beg your pardon, Mr. Mr. Philologist, this is entirely unfounded. The only proof of it is that there is a difference in of language between North and South. I do not see any other difference. We are so many northern men here, and I asked my European friends to pick out the northern and southern men from this assembly where is the difference? A little difference of language. But the Brahmins are the race that came here speaking the Sanskrit language. Well then, they took up Dravidians' language and forgot their Sanskrit. Why should not the other caste have done the same? Why should not all the other castes have come one after the other from the northern India, taken up the Dravidian language and so forgotten their own? That is the argument working both ways. No, do not believe in such silly things. There may have been a Dravidian people who vanished from here and few who remained lived in forest and other places. It is quite possible that the language may have been taken up, but all these are Aryans who came from the north. The whole of India is Aryan, nothing else. Then there is the other idea that the Shudra caste are surely the aborigines. What are they? They are slaves. They say history repeats itself. The Americans, English, Dutch, and the Portugal got hold of the poor Africans and made them work hard while they lived, and their children of mixed birth were born in slavery and kept in that condition for a long time. From that wonderful example, the mind jumps back several thousand years and fancies that the same thing happened here, and our archaeologists dreamed of India being full of dark-eyed aborigines and bright Aryans came from the Lord knows where. According to some, they came from the central Tibets. Others will have it that they came from the Central Asia. There are patriotic Englishmen who think that the Aryans were all red-haired. Others, according to their ideas, think that they were all black-haired. If the writer happened to be the black-haired man, the Aryans were all black-haired. Of late, there was an attempt made to prove that Aryan lived in on the Swiss lakes. I should not be sorry if they had been all drowned there, theory and all. Some say now that they lived in the North Pole. Lord bless the Aryans and their habitations. For as for the truth of these theories, there is not one word in our scriptures, not one, to prove that Aryans ever came from anywhere outside of India, and in ancient India was included Afghanistan. There it ends, and the theory there it ends, and the theory that the Shudras caste were all non-Aryans and they were multitude is equally illogical and equally irrational. It could not have been possible in those days that the few Aryans settled and lived there with the 100,000 slaves at their command. These slaves would have been eaten them up, made chutney of them in 5 minutes. The only explanation is to be found in the Mahabharata, which says that in the beginning of the Satyug there was one caste, the Brahmins, and then by difference of occupation they went on dividing themselves into different castes. And that is the only true and rational explanation that has been given. And in the coming Satyug, all other castes will have to go back to the same condition. The solution of the caste problem in India therefore assumes these forms, not to degrade the higher castes, and not to crush our Brahmins. The Brahminhood is the ideal of the humanity in India, as wonderfully put forward by the Shankaracharya at the beginning of his commentary on the Gita, where he speaks about the reason for Krishna's coming as a preacher for the or for the preservation of the Brahminhood or the Brahminness. That was the great end. This Brahmin, the man of God, he who is has known Brahman, the ideal man, the perfect man must remain. He must not go. And with all the effect of the caste now, we know that we must all be ready to give to the Brahmins this credit that from their that from credit due to them from all other castes. We must be bold enough, must be brave enough to speak of their defect, but at the same time, we must give the credit that is due to them. Remember the old English proverb give every man his due. Therefore, my friends, it is no use fighting among the caste. What good will it do? It will divide us all the more, weaken us all the more, degrade us more. The day of exclusive privileges and exclusive claims are gone forever from the soil of India, and it is one of the great blessings of the British rule in India. Even to the Mohammedan rules, we owe the great blessing, the destruction of exclusive privilege. That rule was, after all, not all bad. Nothing is all bad, nothing is all good. The Mohammedan quest of India came as salvation to the downtrodden of the poor or to the poor. That is why one-fifth of our people have become Mohammedan. It was not the sword that did it all. It would be the highest of madness of thinking to think it was all the work of the sword and fire. And the one-fifth, one half of your Madras people will become Christian if you do not take care. Was there ever a similar thing before in the world than what I saw in the Malabar country? The poor pariah is not allowed to pass through the same street as the high caste man, but if he change his name to the Hodgi Podgi Englishman, it is all right, or the Mohammedan name, it is all right. What inference would you draw except that these Malabaris are all lunatics? Their homes so many lunatic asylum and that they are to be treated with derision by every race in India until they mend their manner and know better. Shame upon them that such wicked and diabolical customs are allowed. Their own children are allowed to die of starvation, but as soon as they take up some other religion, they are well fed. There ought to be no more fight between the castes. The solution is not by bringing down the higher, but by raising the lower up to the level of higher. And that is the line of work that is found in all our books, in spite of what you may hear from some people whose knowledge of their own scriptures, whose capacity to understand the mighty plans of the ancient are only zero. They do not understand, but those do that have brains, that have the intellect to the grasp the whole scopes of the work. They stand aside and follow the wonderful procession of the national life through the ages. They can trace it step by step through all the books, ancient and modern. What is the plan? The ideal at one end is the Brahmin, and the ideal at the other end is the Chandal, and the whole work is the raise of Chandal up to the Brahmin. Slowly and slowly, you find more and more privilege granted to them. There are books where you read such fierce words as this: if the Shudra hears the Vedas, fill his ears with the molten lead, and if he remembers a line, cut his tongue. If he remembers a line, cut his tongue out. If he says to the Brahmin, you Brahmin, cut his tongue too. This is diabolic old barbarism, no doubt. That goes without saying, but do not blame the lawgivers who simply record the customs of some sections of the community. Such devils sometimes arose among the ancients. There have been devils everywhere, more or less in all ages. According to you, we'll find that later on. This tone is modified a little for instance, do not disturb the Shudras, but do not teach them higher things. Then gradually we find in other Smritis, especially in those that have full power now, that if a Shruti, Shraddha, if, especially in those that have full power now, that if the Shudras imitate the manner and customs of the Brahmin, they do live. They ought to be encouraged. Thus it is going on. I have no time to place before you all these workings, nor how they can be traced in details. But coming to the plain facts, we find that all the castes are to rise slowly and slowly. There are thousands of castes, and some are even getting admissions into Brahminhood. For what prevent any caste from declaring they are Brahmins? Thus, caste with all this rigor has been created in that manner. Let us suppose that there are castes here with 10,000 people in each. If this put their heads together and say, we will call ourselves Brahmins, nothing can stop them. I have seen it in my own life. Some caste become strong and as soon as they all agree, who is to say no? Because whatever it was, each caste was exclusive of the other. It is not meddle with other affairs. Even the several divisions of one caste did not meddle with the other divisions, and those powerful epoch makers, Shankaracharya and others, were the great caste makers. I cannot tell you all the wonderful things they fabricated, and some of you may resent what I have to say, but in my travel and experience, I have traced them out and have arrived at the most wonderful result. They would sometimes get holders of Baluchis and at once make them Kshatriyas. Also get hold of the holders of the fishermen and make them Brahmin forthwith. They were all rishis and sages, and we have to bow down to their memories. So be you all rishis and sages. That is the secret. More or less, we shall all be rishis. What is meant by rishi? The pure one. Be pure first, and you will have power. Simply saying, I am rishi will not do. But when you are rishi, you will find that other obey you instinctively. Instinctively. Something mysterious emanates from you which makes them follow you, makes them hear you, makes them unconsciously, even against their will, carry out your plans. That is Rishihood. Now, as to the details, they of course have to be worked out through generations, but this is merely a suggestion in order to show that or show you that these quarrels should cease. Especially do I regret that in modern times there should be so much dissension between the caste. This must stop. It is useless on both sides, especially on the sides of the higher class, the Brahmin, because the day for these privileges and exclusive claims is gone. The duty of every aristocracy is to dig its own grave, and sooner it does so, the better. The more it delays, the more it will fester and worse, and the worse that it will die. It is the duty of the Brahmin, therefore, to work for the salvation of the rest of mankind in India. If he does that, and so long as he does that, he is a Brahmin. But he is no Brahmin when he goes about making money. You, on the other hand, should give help only to the real Brahmin who deserves it. That leads to heaven. But sometimes a gift to another person who does not deserve it leads to the other place, say our scriptures. You must be on your guard about that. He only is the Brahmin who has no secular employment. Secular employment is not for the Brahmin but for the other caste. The Brahmin, I apply that they must work hard to raise the Indian people by teaching them what they know, by giving out the culture that they have accumulated for centuries. It is clearly the duty of Brahmin of India to remember what real Brahminhood is. As Manu says, all this privilege and honor are given to the Brahmin because with him is the treasury of virtues. He must open that treasury and distribute its valuables to the world. It is true that he was the earliest preacher of the Indian race. He was the first to renounce everything in the order to attend to the highest realization of life before other could reach to the idea. It was not his fault that he marched ahead to the other castes. Why did not the other caste so understand and do as he did? Why did they sit down and be lazy and let the Brahmins win the race?